Anywho, I
Whose ad? What was that ad?
Something from
Someone
Uncle
should
Roger.
really bring all this laundry in before it rains.
No, I want to kind of, again, I was attempting to kind of bring it back full circle and saying...
We're back, folks.
Ed, we're back.
Your call is very important to us. Next available psychoanalysis will take place. Okay, I'm back.
But I hope that I have done an okay job at maybe saying that the
Blunder forth, God of War. What are you doing?
The sentiment of...
That is a funny joke that I don't even think I realized how humorous that is.
What are you, me saying?
I forget.
Saying that?
I might be wrong about the quote because I believe the quote, I think it's a Shakespeare thing that says "Thunder forth, God of War." But blunder forth, I didn't realize that it rhymes and is therefore all the funnier. I forget what that is from, or even if it's from something. It might not be a quote. See, people are attributing it to the movie. They're attributing it to the film Lincoln, which is where I first heard it, but I don't think the film is the only place it exists. Well, I'm not going to get it. I thought I would find it much more easily. Anyway. So maybe it's not a quote, but either case, I think it's funny.
No, I'm trying to... So I hope that I've done an okay job at then identifying, I suppose, which parts of Peaky Blinders I consider to be shadow versus maybe
I think
ego.
it was the definitions that helped, because maybe... Perhaps I was playing the game too seriously. And I was trying to define the ego as the true self, when I think you might be better in saying that the id... I mean, definitionally speaking, the id is more the true self than the... I still think that there's an element of... Because as far as I know, the Freudian analysis is that the ego doesn't have a definition outside of being the crossing point between the id and the superego. Which is essentially... Because I think to define the id as the true self...
is rather
pessimistic.
Maybe.
But I also think it's somewhat limiting, because I think that the superego is just as much you as the id is. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
You have to not jump.
I didn't jump. I walked, and I didn't think I was going to keep walking across the beam. Because like that which you desire to be is equally as much a part of you as the subconscious, because you desire that, therefore that means that part of you is what you want to be.
Yes, but desire.
And it also implies that, I think it's a Freudian to imply that the id is the true self is far too Freudian, in that subsumes you, that like the id is all that you are without some sense of external.
Sure.
I think that's why maybe I was trying to define the ego as the true self, of being the melding of your base desires plus your noble desires into what you view yourself as. Because arguably speaking, a thoroughly integrated person would all align. They would know who their deeper self is because they would be aware of it. That would then color their sense of ego, and their superego, if they were properly melded, they would be closer to what they wanted to be. Thus, all three would align.
Aligned, I feel like, is a little strong. Closer.
Well,
maybe.
the truly ideal person would be, and I don't think anybody has reached that.
That would certainly be a virtuous man.
Well, it would be basically, it would basically be a Buddhistic character, like a form of perfection that I don't think anyone has attained. But arguably speaking, that would be the ideal state. It would be to have all of them align. So maybe that's why I was thinking of the ego as like the true perception of self, but maybe that's inaccurate. Because I do think there's some limiting aspects to say.
No.
He hasn't seen you yet. Well, you shot him in the jugular, and he just was like, "Bro, not cool."
I knew that the minute he moved, I wasn't going to be able to take the shot. But
by your own definition, Arthur would be more the ego,
more representative of, I think, who I see myself being, more than Tommy. I think Tommy is more the extreme
Well, generally the id will be the extreme form.
Sure.
Again, if you're integrated, your ego and your id will be close.
And that's why I say when that scene when Tommy says, Arthur, my brother and I are the same person, I'm like, I definitely, that to me was very much okay. Like that, that's a very good representation of me, is even just their relationship, to be very
well, so basically they're your Silco and Jinx.
Yeah.
Again, we've described that the thing about it is it's the combination.
Yeah.
So I guess I never heard you speak. This is...
The hard part about it is...
What's funny is that this makes my appreciation for Alfie become all the funnier. Because Alfie...
both loves Tommy and almost hates Arthur.
No, I think there were... No, I don't think... No.
He's got a weird hard-on for Arthur.
But that's not the... I think he teased him a lot. I don't think that it was any... I don't think it was malicious.
Well, maybe
but I'm saying I think that makes my appreciation of Arthur
because...
Or Alfie, rather. Because Alfie and Thomas are distinctly different.
Yeah.
But they're different in ways that make them interact well. Whereas I really liked Arthur as a character. I thought he was a very compelling character. But... I do agree that he's perhaps too much of Tommy in him, that it makes them, again, they almost do feel like two sides of one character.
And yes.
Whereas Alfie is very distinct, and I think that sort of makes our self-insert as a little bit more prescient.
Truth. Well, when I like that comparison of you and I versus myself
again, Alfie,
in my inner battle.
Thomas can obviously pull one over on Alfie, but Alfie can get served just as well
100%.
back. So it's not a sense of like Alfie's the one being played. It's like Alfie also plays.
That great scene in which he does do that, and basically when Tommy gets upset about it, he goes,
I want him to know
I'm sorry.
His anger is unfreaking justified.
I love that part. Because it's like, it's 100%.
If you're going to shoot me, you do it for a good reason.
But I do think that it represents well in that Arthur is very much a good representation of sometimes my rashness, but also the degree in which I carry the weight of my actions. By comparison to the more extreme version of myself that gets to the point where I'm pressed, where it's like, forget it. I'm just, everybody be darned. I'm going to just do what I'm going to do. Get out of my freaking way. So there you go. Again, that's a very terrible representation of my inner battle.
But I guess that's the question, is if you could put a percentage on it, how much of a match would you call it? Because it's
far more close than you think it is, because there are parts of my even just inner kind of...
Well, because ultimately, when you talk about the inner monologue, is in a way a good representation of your of your ego.
And I would say that it's far closer than I think you may
to Arthur or to Thomas. Because Arthur, I can see more than Thomas.
Yes, to Arthur. Okay. And I think the reason being that even within the whole context of the mob thing, that even though I know that's not me in totality, it's certainly the idea that it was a part of my family history is not just a random thematic element in my life. It is certainly an actual, like, I resonate with that on almost like a identity level.
That's something you can obviously choose, though.
It is, but
I'm choosing it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a degree of like, I've always felt, Stephen Knight actually talks about this, where when he was told stories, it was never a, oh, that's awful. It was more of like a fascination.
Well,
and as a kid,
I can understand the fascination. That's why mob movies are a thing. Yeah,
but it's more of a fascination. It's less of a passive kind of, that's kind of an interesting environment or way of living or anything like that. It's more of like that's a part of what raised me. I mean, let's be honest. It raised my dad and therefore subsequently me. I mean, that there's just elements. I mean, I met my grandpa many times. I remember going into his house going, this is a little weird. Like, I remember walking into his... No, I mean, walking into his giant office with his gold phone on this desk remember him telling my dad things like, I could take care of that for you if you want me to. Mm-hmm. And I was like, as a kid, I was kind of going, what does he mean? I bet you he could. Are you sure he doesn't? Are you sure you don't want him to? Like, and so there's a part of me that on a personal level just goes, yeah, I kind of miss that. That element of maybe even, albeit misplaced but perceived control that I appreciated. So that's the part of the shadow that I'm like, with Tommy, I'm going,
but I think that
I'm a very controlling person when left to my own devices.
Again, I still think of that as being I think of it as cathartic because of the sense that you know that you, not to go so extreme as to say, oh, it's interesting because I know I won't, because that's too definitive. But there's the element of,
it's cathartic to know that I'm aware of myself.
Like, wouldn't it be nice to be able to be just like, no, I will dictate how this goes.
Right.
I think that's obviously got an appealing thing, but that doesn't mean that you're the kind of person who goes into every situation saying, I will dictate how this goes.
Right.
Because that will create problems that you won't necessarily want to deal with.
Agreed. And I think the thing that
that's why the shadow versus persona
the thing that I struggle with the most is that where I do feel like the shadow is very much what was represented in Tommy. The reason that I feel a little bit maybe sheepish to admit that there's elements of my actual ego that are in Arthur is that the reason he is, I don't know if I'd call it unhinged. The reason that he is more of a flight risk.
He can be unhinged, not always.
Is because he's not always aware of everything. And that, I think, is true of me. And it bothers me about myself in that I go, I wish I was more, on top of everything. But I think the reason or the way that I would have to be on top of everything is to the controlling degree that Tommy is, where it's like I literally have my fingers in everybody's business and in everything and in every situation. And at that point I go, that's so much energy to put into life.
Well, exactly. So that's what I mean when I say the sense of self as like, because in a sense, I suppose when we talk about the concept of integration, once the shadow becomes integrated, it also becomes part of the superego.
Right.
But perhaps in a healthily channeled direction where you say, okay, obviously I wouldn't do that, but I could use those elements on these things which would have justifiable ends.
Right.
So,
which is very
essentially that's why I'm saying Arthur,
in that regard.
Arthur, the reason he is the way he is because he can't be Thomas.
Right.
And in a way, he might sometimes wish he could be because then he would have more of the composure.
Correct.
But he also, I think, there's also elements where you wish you wouldn't because you go, I don't want to have to deal with that much stuff.
Right. Well, I think his element,
die even if I get him.
The sentiment of him saying, I'm a good man, but these hands belong to the devil. The reason I liked that quote is because his sentiment in that, and I don't know that I concur with your analysis of that, because you seem to think that was absolving himself of any responsibility to do evil, as much as I felt like it was more of a...
I think when you insist upon your own goodness, you are always rationalizing in some sense. It would be far more honest to say, I am not a good man, which is what Thomas would say.
True. But
because it is the truth. You go, you can't argue that I do bad things, but I am a good person. It's like, no, you just have to rip off the Band-Aid and acknowledge, I'm not a great person.
Which
and some
is
people,
a difficult thing
it's hard to
for
do.
me to...
It's hard for everybody to do. Again, everybody wants to think of themselves as a good person.
I think
that is precisely the root of many of their problems.
Well, I think the whole...
And this also is not to say that you should give up on trying to be a good person because you're acknowledging this. It's simply... The only way you could be a good person is to acknowledge it.
I thought it was funny that the way that Arthur justified it to Alfie specifically was that he actually went... what did he say? I'm Old Testament. Because the principle, if you don't know specifically what the weight that carries, essentially what he's saying is, I am a exacting person. Like, I may be bad at times, but as long as I can keep it...
I still find the concept of the kinsman redeemer rather fascinating. It's like, there was a guy... If someone killed a member of your family by accident or on purpose, you would have the responsibility to hunt them down and kill them. And, like, they had the whole legal system was like, okay, the person will have to flee to one of these cities, and then they will have to be held on trial. And the funny thing about it is, if you made the case before the city gates, as they say, there was still a chance that the dude could be found guilty, and then you'd still have to kill him. And you would actually be seen as, like, fulfilling your familial duty to do that.
Right.
It's like, I almost wonder, would we be better off with that legal system?
Well, I kind of like the whole...
Because, again, if you did it wantonly, then you'd be that guy for someone else.
It harkens back to the old school principle of honor, like the whole doing
we certainly
things
don't
for
have
your
that
honor.
much anymore.
And I think, like, the idea of duels and things of that nature, I'm like...
Those weren't always about
They
honor.
weren't... Well, they weren't always about
They were often
honor.
about vanity. Or they could easily be about vanity.
Sure. Dad,
Mr. Shah, you keep getting him in the shoulder. Oh, thanks for the acupuncture. Whoa.
Oh, they just dropped me like a newborn babe. Anyway, well, that was that topic.
Was it?
Or did you have more to unpack on that?
Did I?
Let's go back to Arcane.
Yeah, we didn't talk enough about Arcane. I had to muscle that in there somewhere. Because I would, again, I guess for me, the Jinx thing is less of like a 1-to-1, but it's awfully close. It's not like, because Silco, I'm genuinely just like, that's just, the wrong circumstances, and that would be it. But Jinx, I admit, it's less of a perfect mirror, but it is definitely enough that I'm like, okay, that's a lot of me.
In that, like the motivations or some of the, what is it that specifically?
In a sense, I think
more actions based, like.
Well, certainly not actions, because again, those would be the elements that actually do distinguish. I just think in the sense of. I had a thing prepared for this, and then we were still talking about other stuff. I forgot how exactly it was going to go.
To be fair, I just kind of threw you into that and shoehorned you in.
Two shots like this
left
really
you onto your own device.
I can certainly understand. I was actually a little bit weirded out by how anti-Powder you were at the beginning when we first started watching it.
Because you were like,
she's far too. She's like, oh, she's too like insecure and like doesn't. And I was just kind of like, well, okay, but she is also a child, and the things that she wants to do are noble. So like, I want to be a useful member of the team, and I don't want to be, always the runt people have to carry. I'd rather be able to, be of use.
Right.
And it's like, I can certainly respect that, because that's very much that's a philosophy that I hold. That's like, I certainly don't want to be the person other people have to carry around.
Yeah.
And so I respect that, and I think it's mostly just the kind of okay, that hit the brick, and now I got people behind me. Okay, that's not helpful. I can't see I can't see my targeting. Okay, pear-shaped. What does pear-shaped mean, by the way? Do you have any? Okay, well, it means that. I have no clue what the etymology of that is.
I would not know, actually. Pear-shaped.
I think that there is... I guess we did talk a bit about the sort of dissociative Zen concept, and I think that there is an element of that. It's like, I can... Because arguably, I suppose I really ought to write this Vader Jinx episode that I had in my mind of like a video essay. Because essentially, I see lots of people making that and making the comparisons, and the show itself does certainly present lots of opportunities for that. But I think the fundamental distinction, and maybe this is just an interpretation, there might be other people who identify with Jinx for exactly the opposite of this reason. But I think the difference between them is that Vader does not want to be Vader. Vader wishes he could be Anakin again, right, and he doesn't think he can.
Right.
Jinx does not want to be Powder again because Powder was the weak version of herself.
Yeah, I agree.
And so the pressure that she feels by people to be that, it's like, a lot of people think of Vi as this sort of Luke character of like, I know there's good in you. She even says those very words.
Yeah.
And that's like, I made the comment to you once that I actually think that there is a tremendous insult in essentially arguing that someone else's agency has been stripped from them.
Right.
Because essentially Vi believes you're only this way because Silco manipulated you, which essentially is saying you're still the useless kid I remember. Right. And you would only be this way because somebody else did it, because I used to be the one pulling your strings. Now, of course, that makes Vi sound far more villainous than I mean to her to. But I'm not fully on the Vi as a hero train either. Like, I don't think that that's her conscious belief is like, I want to be the one pulling her strings. But I don't think she realizes that she was previously the person pulling her strings. And that her no longer being that... Again, I'm not trying to impute a malicious...
No, but there is a degree of...
She used to... The thing is, Powder used to have no real agency.
It's an embraced ignorance.
And
we've talked about this, that I hate this principle, that when you act like you... my mom did this to me a lot, and this is why I actually do have a problem with the whole idea of taking someone's agency away, is because...
Or not even doing that, but to imply that they have had it taken away.
To imply that somehow you aren't making your own choices, it's like, that's incredibly insulting.
Well, exactly, and that's ultimately what I think is the greatest insult of the thing, and that's why by the final confrontation, I was like, friggin' stick it to her, because I don't like her anymore. Now, again, I'm not trying to impute maliciousness. I just think it was radical ignorance.
Right, well, but again, embraced, because she had lots of opportunity to have a change of heart.
She's been in prison. I mean, I think it's hard to remember the fact that she's out of prison for all of, like, 2 days by the time the show ends. So admittedly, to be fair, she probably hasn't had that much time.
Is it only 2 days? It doesn't feel like 2 days.
It doesn't. It's well, because think about it. She gets out of prison at the end of episode... She's found in prison at the end of episode 4. Gets out in episode 5, spends episodes 6... No, by the end of episode 6, they've met again. And then she gets kidnapped by the people. That's episode 7. They meet on the bridge again in episode 8. So literally, it takes place over maybe 3 days max. So it's like, it's pretty fast. It's just that we've seen the development on the other side, so we feel like, how can you not see it? I can understand that.
But see, part of it for me is... I don't ever come into any relationship that I haven't seen somebody in years and assume that they're the same person.
Well,
I'm saying that genuinely. Like, that sounds like I'm somehow patting myself on the back, but on a I'm not trying to. What I'm saying is, I have always
on a naturalist. Consciously done that?
No,
or are you,
on a naturalist level, I have always gone. Well, of course, I can't assume that they're the same individual. Well, that might just be.
I think again, that's your Troyness showing.
Maybe, but I just
sort of
it would be unfair of me.
People.
It would be an unfair assumption of me to assume that they don't live their life. It's a bit of the, what is it called?
But again, I think the unintegrated make that assumption because they would never change. Again, we're gonna sound awfully uppity, but it's like people who don't have self-reflection don't understand the people who do, because they think everything they do. Well, here's the better than that, because I think it's not exactly always self-reflection. It's the people who believe life happens to them can't accept that other people happen to life.
Right.
They think you must be in this circumstance because your circumstances were just better.
I think
and it's
also
like, no, I chose to be the way I am because I made that choice. And other people think, well, I don't have choices. Of course they do.
But people
they
also
just abdicate
ignore
their
the
choices.
whole, what is that principle?
I am in a bad sandwich.
No. The name is escaping me right now, where everybody has experience that's outside of the philosophy that everyone has experience and life that happens to them that you know nothing about. And I can't...
Oh, you've talked about it before. I don't.
And I can't remember the word. But that is what it is. It's this idea that, for me, I've always considered that. To assume of anyone that you know who they are backwards and front always is nothing short of arrogance.
Yeah. Well, or profound ignorance.
But I think a bit of both. I mean, like...
Yeah, so that's where I think that how do we get onto that part?
Talking about the idea of Vi
and not overly... Oh, the Luke comparison. People try to make... Because, again, she says the same words.
Well...
And ultimately, in the final confrontation...
Well, we're real...
What I felt like I wanted Jinx to say was basically... And she basically does, but she doesn't put it in as many words. Well, she kind of does, though. The final thing she says is, I thought you could love me like you used to, even though I'm different. But you've changed, too. And that was the thing that I went... freaking someone finally said it.
Right,
because the problem with Vi is she thinks she's the only one who hasn't changed.
Right.
Like, oh, the world's gone so different. And it's like, by the end of it, she's like been accomplice to the accidental death of a child.
Right.
And is literally shrugging it off going, well, he had it coming. And I'm like, you don't get to call yourself a good person when you do that. And that's the thing. I think if you were to come to Silco and say you're not a good person, he'd be like, no, but I'm doing what needs to be done. Because he's basically acknowledging, I have to do what needs to be done. And if that he doesn't die from rockets and exploding bullets, what do you think will kill him?
I thought maybe a sniper rifle to the brain,
cross that off the list. Whereas I think the problem with Vi is I think she's very, again, this is sort of the lesson that Vander tried to teach that he never quite got through, is that she thinks she's justified in a lot of the things she does. She thinks that she's on the right side and that therefore whatever she does must be right.
Right.
And it's like, no. The things you do aren't great. And again, I'm not even suggesting, I again will defend Silco a lot of the time, primarily because he acknowledges the things he's doing aren't great, but he's also like, but some things have to get done.
Right.
I'm not going to... It's a bit of the having your cake and eating it, basically.
Like
it's one thing to say, I will hold on to my reputation as a good person. Vander is this way. He was going, I will hold on to this moral stance at the expense of what I want to see change.
Bring about, right.
And so it goes like, well, no, I'm going to sacrifice the moral stance to get things to change the way they should be.
Right.
The problem with Vi is she tries to have it both ways, and she doesn't realize she's having it both ways because she's, again, not as self-aware as she ought to be.
Well, neither was Vander.
I think he was, because I think he made the choice deliberately, and I just would say that I think it was probably not the wisest choice. But he's going... He knew that he wasn't going to... He knew he wasn't having the effect that he needed, but he also went, I'm going to stick to my principles.
It was less than the actual evil of doing what was necessary.
Yeah.
He was not a Churchill, in other words.
I don't know exactly what you're meaning by that.
Many people made the comment of Churchill that he was not specifically a great man, but he was the man for the position.
Well, exactly. The people, it's a bit of the... Whoop.
Well,
I actually thought Jordan Peterson's analysis of Moses and Joseph, or Joshua, was fascinating because he brought it up in a similar context. He was talking at first about entrepreneurs are often not the best people to run the companies they've built because it takes a different mindset to build something than to maintain it.
Right, totally agree.
He's going, that is why Moses was not the leader in the Promised Land.
Right.
Because he couldn't have been.
Right. In the same way,
Churchill was literally ousted immediately after the war. Like, everyone went, okay, thank you, but you're not a man for peacetime. Joshua or David doesn't build the temple,
right?
Because he's going, you are not a man of peace. You are a man of war.
Right.
We need those. That's the thing modern society doesn't get. So we think, well, now it's peacetime. We don't need men of war. It's like, well, no, you need them on tap at least. You need them on retainer. But I think that there's that element, and that's where I think Vander was very much a man of peace, and I think he chose to be that. I don't think he was. I think he chose it after the. I mean, they do a good job of his arc where he's going. He used to be the man of war, and basically went. The cost of this is more than I'm willing to pay.
Right.
Whereas Silco went, it's not for me. I will pay the cost because I believe in it, and that's primarily where I think the moral busybodiness of people who try to dictate. We talked about the one weird and Batman interpretation of someone online that I was just like, I don't agree with you, because the idea that because it would be a heavy psychological weight to be like, oh, I've killed people in the name of this, and that would weigh on you. I just go, and therefore no one should do it because that no one should bear that. I'm like, sorry, there's people who can, and those people should because someone has to. Like, again, we talked about the concept of the state executioner. It's like, yeah, that was both an honored and a hated job because no one wanted to be around you, but everyone knew that someone had to do it. So it was like, we're glad someone is willing to get their hands dirty so that the rest of us don't have to.
Right, exactly.
I think to look on those people with scorn is the most arrogant thing you can do when your hands are clean.
Sadly,
it's like your hands get to be clean because theirs are not. Otherwise, everyone would have to be doing this.
Well, it's the whole principle of St. Valerie and many of the other famous war battles where people have come back going, we have had literally no honor.
Well, it's
coming
Vietnam.
back. Well, that's what I mean. I mean, it's those types of wars where it's like, well, okay, really?
Yeah.
But
well,
yet...
you can go to the Civil War concept with that, but no one's ready for that conversation.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Just going, our state called and we answered, and then we get to be hated because of it. Again, the politicians deserve most of the scorn, I agree, and they deserve it, but the individual soldiers, I think... There ought to be a book. I am not qualified to write it, but someone wrote, and it's a good book, I'll recommend it, Apostles of Disunion, which was about the politicians who basically gathered support for the Confederacy. And the point of the book is the Civil War was, of course, fought about slavery, and it was not a matter of states' rights, because the politicians who sought support basically were acknowledging this is about slavery.
Right. They framed it however they wanted to, but yeah.
But I think the difference with that, and I think the book that ought to be written is, where are the letters of soldiers writing to their families?
Right.
Because I want to know what they thought. We can condemn the politicians because politicians basically are deserving of scorn in any and all times. But the men who fought, and there are examples of letters of people who are like, the politicians, who knows what was told to the individual guys? And that's what I want to know. Because it's entirely possible this happened in Vietnam, where it's like the government just lied to people.
Yeah.
Is it their fault that they went to fight for a government that lied to them, or is it the government's fault for lying?
Right.
So to say that, well, because we know the politicians had this motive, and therefore everyone they recruited to the rank and file felt that way too, and I don't know. It's entirely reasonable that those people fought for a war that wasn't what was being fought. To which I'd say that's tragic. But they don't deserve to be reviled. Neither do the guys in Vietnam.
Well, sadly,
we're talking more about Vi though than Jinx, and I don't know. I think that's ultimately the nature of. That's the thing about Arcane, is that everything's so tied together. You can't talk about one without talking about them all, pretty much. But why did I get onto that specifically? The concept of being different and something.
Well, I think that.
Vader. Did I finish the Vader essay? That Jinx isn't Vader and she shouldn't be treated as such, and Vi's not Luke? Is that how this got about?
You were talking about that. I think
we need a better strategy for this, by the way, because we keep trying the same 3 options and they all fail. So something's got to change.
Let's see. Is this a
concussion and EMP? We don't have any regular blasting types. That'll blind them, and you'll only have a handful of seconds to get up close, but it might be enough.
Can I... I'm wondering whether I can sneak up between... Never mind. Not now, apparently.
Not currently.
Well, that didn't work for me.
Just to wrap up, basically the point of the essay that I was going to make is, again, Anakin... And you mentioned Star Wars. We may not have the chance to get into it at this point.
No.
But the thing I think is potent about Star Wars, and why Star Wars is another of my favorite films, or film series, I should say, is that Anakin, I think the most potent moment, I'll nod to the things you were going to get to later, but the most potent moment for me in Star Wars is specifically in Episode 3. Anakin is on Mustafar, having just killed the Separatist leaders.
Right.
And is standing over the balcony of look of the whole lava river, and is just crying. Because again, these are all interpretations, but I can't help but interpret that as his recognition, even in that moment, just literally this is less than a day after he's joined, Sidious. I think in that moment he's already realized I've made a mistake. But I think because of the rigid Jedi sort of upbringing, he was under the impression that, well, because I've made this mistake, there's no going back for me. So the only way out is through. And I think that's why the Luke revelation is not only powerful on his behalf, but it's powerful, I think. Luke gets the honor for being right about saying, there's still good in him, because that's no longer a naive statement. That isn't just... It's not as insipid as it sounds, whereas I feel like in Vi's case, it feels very much like self-reassurance.
Yeah.
Whereas Luke ends up being right, because Vader does wish that he could go back to being Anakin. He just doesn't think he can. He believes this whole time he's thought... he says, it's too late for me. He doesn't say, you're wrong, I'm not that person. He says, it's too late. I can't go back. And that's ultimately what the showdown with the Emperor makes him see, is that no, he can go back, because Luke does.
And largely,
I don't know why this is my strategy, because I don't think it. Well, okay, this might work. I'm gonna get shot right after this, though.
Largely, it's worth stating, I suppose, maybe not largely, but it's worth stating that the Jedi have some responsibility in his turn.
Yeah, the rigidness of it. Again,
not just the rigidness, but they kind of set him up for almost feeling like he was battling the dark side more than a lot of other Jedi.
Yes,
like
but
internally.
arguably, yeah, and I think that's largely due to the fact that the concept of the prophecy is largely what screwed him up.
But they were afraid.
Someone made a humorous joke.
They themselves, as Jedi, as much as they talk about, fear is they were themselves afraid of it.
And this was I think it was a Tumblr. It was almost like a 4chan green text fake conversation that sometimes people do as memes. Where it was like, 8-year-old slave boy, where it's like you're actually the destined heroes that's going to save us all, but you also have a whole lot of power we don't understand, so we're super afraid of you. And it was just Anakin being like, I'm 8? Like what is any of it's like, what hope did he have of not being screwed up when that's the kind of introduction you get?
Well, and
you're destined to save us all, but you're essentially a human warhead that we don't know how to handle. So
arguably, I would say the only hope he had died in Qui-Gon Jinn.
Exactly, and that's very much the interpretation I believe you're meant to get, is that Qui-Gon Jinn being a very kind of looser, less
gray Jedi,
rigid, is going. That would have been his only hope, because again, Luke, having no understanding of the dark side, arguably, and I think a lot of people are right in saying he only beats Vader because he's only been a Jedi for like 2 years by the time he faces Vader, who's been a Jedi for 40 and a Sith for half of that. It's like he would, in terms of raw power, he should have absolutely just wiped the floor with him.
Right.
So the only way Luke could have won was by using his anger as he's taunted to do. But because he doesn't have the rigid training, he goes, I've disarmed my father. I'm not going to kill him because I don't want to.
Well,
and I don't have to. I've given into anger, but I can also give it back up.
I would make
and that's the thing Anakin didn't think he could do.
I would actually make a brief comparison to Silco in this regard. Luke and his anger is different than Anakin's, because Anakin's ends up becoming something he doesn't feel like he can turn from, because it was motivated out of fear of losing Padme and of a lot of other things. Luke's is justified in the same way that Silco and his responses are justified. And notice when he was literally on the verge of about to get everything he desired, when pressed to essentially abandon his principles on the whole Jinx situation, he said, no, I'm not going to do that. That's not the whole point of this. Because he did still have a degree of line morally to what was okay and what wasn't. And I go, in the same way, Luke's anger could be argued as more righteous indignation more than anything else.
Maybe. But I don't think the point I'm making even requires that point, because the difference is, I think you could equally make it a justification for Anakin's state of... Again, this is far more meta knowledge. You'd have to know more about the Clone Wars and about the things that happened not in the films. For his disillusionment with the Jedi is very founded.
Right,
yeah.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
So his anger could just as easily be justified, but the thing is, he feels that once he's given into it, it's too late. It's like, because the idea is, well, you're on the slippery slope and you'll never get out now, so he basically thinks he can't undo it.
Right.
Whereas I think Luke basically shows him that he can, because Luke just doesn't have that training. He doesn't have the brainwashing, to call it perhaps a bit severely. But he's just like, it turns out I can, use the... I think 3 of those is just absurd. I don't know how we're going to take him down.
Well, what's religious ideology pressed to its worst? I mean...
Zealotry, I guess? Why are you asking this?
No, that's what I'm getting at. It's that... The Jedi zealotry is what
I would
really
say
provoked it.
Palpatine is not wrong when he says the thing the Jedi feared was losing their status.
Right.
Because they had enjoyed relative comforts for so long.
And to a degree, a high honor.
And I don't think that it was it's not a malicious thing. I think it was, again, a sort of subconscious. It's like they were complacent in their place at the top.
Right.
Not that they were scheming to like, we're going to hold on to this because we want it. I think it's just that they failed to view that there could be any other way because they thought, well, this is just how it's always going to be because it's how it's been for so long. That doesn't do anything for us.
Maybe I had some sort of...
But anyways, the Jinx Vader thing I think is just different with. So that's my whole opinion on Vader and why that moment speaks to me is because I think he wishes he could be who he used to be. He just doesn't think he can, and I don't think Jinx wishes that. And I think the insult of saying you're only the way you are because someone else has manipulated you is just awfully dehumanizing.
Yes.
Because Jinx basically does have to come back and say, no, I'm the way I am. And what's his head? Echo even says this to Vi, and she just doesn't believe him. He says he worked for Silco because she wants to. She doesn't work for him because she has to. She works for him because he wants to. And it's like, there is an element of, can't people just accept the choices you make? Now, that doesn't mean they have to condone them if they disagree, but it is a little bit like the de-personhood of you would only make this choice if you felt this, if you were being twisted into it. It's like, no, I can choose to make choices that you don't agree with. And I think many people don't offer that understanding to people. They think you must make choices I would agree with, otherwise you are either manipulated or you are just a bad person. You're in the grip of some other sort of ideology, if it's not a person, that makes you... Because obviously if you thought rationally, you'd think like me.
Right.
And that's just a deeply arrogant and insulting position.
Totally agree.
So anyways, that's why I think Arcane is personally more my thing than Peaky, because Arcane had both of those elements. I felt the resonance with both of those characters. And then again, I've said the fact that their intersection... The parts of them, again, this is sort of the fully formed integrated personhood, is that basically the areas in which they overlap are also areas in which, by my analogy, it's like that means part of my ego and part of my shadow are overlapping, which is the definition of integration.
Right.
So it's like, that's why it was such a powerful thing, and I don't think Peaky had that because...
I think it had it in a different manner. I don't disagree that it was maybe not as... You can't make quite the same psychological parallels in Peaky than you do in Arcane, but I do think for me that the concept of ego and shadow being very closely interconnected without being exactly the same is certainly present still for me within Peaky Blinders. I think...
Okay. That was supposed to go towards the other guys, and now I'm blind. Well, that was stupid. I wanted that to knock these other two guys out so that they wouldn't shoot me immediately. Well, they are not as big as that guy, so I should... Well, if I could hit them... Those guys aren't as armored, so if I can knock them sort of unconscious while I'm taking out Big Boy, then I can just shoot them.
I do think that one thing that I think is distinct and worth noting is that Arcane allows you to see the character arcs of the people as they are changing and perhaps reincarnating or rebirthing themselves within the story. In Peaky, they allude to that as a principal
we've
concept.
Talked about, you don't like being told things.
What?
You would rather people hint at them and then you get to pick them up rather than being told, this is how the story goes.
Well, like, for instance, in Peaky Blinders that a huge part of their kind of let's live life to as best we can, get it right now is more because of the whole they should have died in the war anyway concept. And they allude to that throughout the story and eventually end up actually using it as a principal kind of framework with the death of John and all these other things. In that it was pretty significant in why Tommy and Arthur became who they were. And so, but I think you see that more up close and personal with Arcane because
Well, I think
they walk through it with you.
Well, and I think the element of them being separate, being separate characters, as in like this is only my interpretation, but the fact that I get to see aspects of myself fully fleshed out in individual other people rather than just this character, all of their parts are similar to all of my parts. It's like, no, I've been dissected and now I'm watching each of the dissected pieces of me interact in a way that is quite accurate to how they would interact. And that's basically like saying I'm watching myself be vivisected, and it's a little bit uncomfortable, which is why it had a bit of an impact where I was like, I need to do some reflection based off of this.
The latter portion, I agree with you. For me, happened in Peaky Blinders. The former, as far as the actual parts being pulled apart and whatever else, and you kind of watching those pieces. Because you had your
moment, you had your Victor moment.
I
screwed that up.
Within Peaky, I did.
No, Was there a character named Victor in Peaky?
No, that's what I mean. Yeah, within Arcane, it's a little bit more psychologically not obvious.
I would say there's a lot more archetypal. It's a very Jungian show.
Very much so. Yes,
it's very archetypal. I mean, that's many people have made that it feels like a Greek drama,
right?
Because in many ways it is. And so that's
yes.
I just found that compelling, and I was going to add.
So we were talking about the whole Star Wars thing, and about the comparisons there.
I think the only thing I was going to say is I guess this is slightly worth commenting on is, again, we talked about the agency thing, but I do think it's significant. And again, this may come down to like an English teacher reading into it too much, but I think there's very significant fact that Anakin is given the name Vader. Jinx chooses the name Jinx.
Right.
That is her own choice. And it's not shown, but I believe that happened instantly. Like episode 3, I don't think Silco knows her name because he doesn't seem to know any of their names at the beginning. So it's like, I imagine that if the moment he asked her what her name was, she probably would have said it right then. That's my headcanon at least.
Yeah.
So that's where I go. The fact that that's a matter of choice, and again, then it comes down to you can morally judge the choice, and I go, in my opinion, I don't think she deserves any sort of moral not repercussions, not the word. The word just gave me. I don't think she is as culpable as many people would because of the fact that she is a child going through what you go through. It's like, I don't see how anyone could have hoped to be different from this. An adult going through this, you might say, well, you're an adult, you should have a framework of, way of moral stance that would prevent you from making this choice. But I just go, okay, as a child, there was no chance that this wouldn't go this way.
Right.
So that's where I guess I don't feel the moral condemnation a lot of people suggest, is I just go, I don't think that that's fair. And as a result, I guess there's a degree of sympathy that I might have that not everyone will, which might be the explanation of my...
It took me a while to get to that sympathetic moment. I think for you arrived at it quicker.
Well, because you apparently weren't... You thought Powder was annoying.
Until the moment that I felt like Vi was an absolute... Again, well, no, it goes to the whole principle of why your concept of dishonesty as a part of manipulation bothers me so on a visceral level, is because to me, disrespecting and literally basically casting off or disregarding somebody's personhood to that level is like there's nothing more unforgivable to me. Like what she did to Powder in basically saying, see, you are actually this, and we're gonna just leave you be, or leave you out to dry, kind of a thing, was like, yeah, you kind of brought that on yourself. Even if you would have come back at that point and you wouldn't have gotten arrested, I'm like, that doesn't justify
people
it.
Make the argument, it's like, well, she obviously couldn't rectify it, which she clearly knew she needed to, but it's like, yeah, but that's a little bit...
You don't get to come
back from, at least not without tremendous effort.
Right.
That certainly wouldn't have been a, sorry, it's okay. So, and that's, I guess, what a lot of people wish would happen. And I'm just like, no. That's why I was kind of annoyed in the episode 6 thing, where it's like, she gives one last chance to like maybe I'll be able to find her again. I'm like, I was already at that point in the show. I'm like, no, I wouldn't have. I'd be like, no, I get lost. I would have thrown that thing away. The weird little beacon that she gives her. It's like, no, if this would happen to me, I'd be like, I'm tossing this. I won't, even if I ever wanted to, I won't allow myself to go back to you. Now, maybe that's because of a sense of far greater
black and white resolve.
Betrayal, I guess, where it's like, no, I've made my choice and I won't go back on it.
Right.
Because I admit that when I have made up my mind, it will not change for hell or high water.
Right.
And I am slow to make up my mind for that very reason. I am shooting at figments. This isn't working. So that's where I would have gone. At that point in the show, I'm like, no, I would have just been like, no, I'm tossing this out. I'm never going to consider you again. Because I guess the thing with the revelation that she's been in prison and didn't actually leave, I'm like, I'm not sure that would have made a difference.
Well, for some people that like excused her, and I'm like, no.
Yeah,
sorry.
I just go, no, it kind of doesn't, because you went to prison for different reasons. I mean, obviously she goes to prison somewhat, that's a question I don't think I even realized. I was going to say she goes to prison unjustly, because obviously Marcus just grabs her because he doesn't know who did it. He just needs someone to give to the council to basically get them off his back.
Right.
But then it turns out, it just occurred to me, she is actually the culprit of the crime he was investigating. So to say she went to prison unjustly is not entirely true. Obviously, it wasn't due process in that sense, which is sort of not just, but it is a little bit like you went to prison for a crime you did commit, and that prevented you from being reconciled for a bad thing you did do. So I don't quite get the sympathy a lot of people give, other than I think a lot of people probably see themselves in her.
Well, but then
a lot of the I need to stop using that word. A lot of the less self-reflective see themselves perhaps in the less self-reflective character.
Well, I also
and thus don't want them to face unnecessary consequences.
Well, again, I was going to add it in the less maybe Taoist perspective or Buddhist perspective, the idea that life happens to you versus you happening to things, or you.
Well, I do believe life happens to you if you let it.
Right, but
that's
the
again
point is
a Jungian concept.
With
if you, what is it? I forget the quote. It's a good one. He says, "The world will ask you who you are, and if you have no answer, it will tell you." And it's like, it's true. That's why I said when people are not wrong when they say that the world happens to them, but that is nonetheless a thing that they have allowed. And that's, I guess, the distinction is it's not you always had the choice, you always have the choice, but once you have given it up, you're not wrong in saying things will happen to you because you've given up the choice to make them different. But anyways,
yeah, there you go.
How much laundry is this? It's a lot of laundry.
We're not Buddhists.